It must have been about 3:50 in the morning that something caused Hoffmann to wake. He struggled up from the depths of sleep and opened his eyes to behold a celestial vision of fiery white light. It was geometrically formed, like a graph with thinly spaced horizontal lines and wide-apart vertical columns, but with no data plotted. A mathematician's dream. But not, in fact, a dream, he realized after squinting at it for a few seconds. Rather the result of 8 500-watt tungsten halogen security lights shining brilliantly through the slats of the window blinds. Enough wattage to light a small soccer ground. He'd been meaning to have them changed. The lights were on a 30-second timer. As he waited for them to turn off, he considered what might have interrupted the infrared beams that crisscrossed the garden to trigger them. It would be a cat, he thought, or a fox, or a piece of overgrown foliage waving in the wind. And after a few seconds the lights were indeed doused and the room returned to darkness. But now Hoffmann was wide awake. He reached for his mobile. It was one of a batch specially produced for the hedge fund that could encrypt certain sensitive phone calls and emails. To avoid disturbing Gabrielle, she detested this habit of his even more than she hated him smoking, he switched it on under the duvet and briefly checked the profit and loss screen for Far Eastern trading. In Tokyo, Singapore and Sydney, the markets were, as predicted, falling, but VIX Al4 was already up 0.3%, which meant by his calculations that he'd made almost $3 million since going to bed. Satisfied, he turned off the device and replaced it on the nightstand, and that was when he heard a noise. Soft, unidentifiable, and yet oddly disturbing, as if someone was moving around downstairs. Staring at the tiny red dot of light of the smoke detector fixed to the ceiling, he extended his hand cautiously beneath the duvet towards Gabrielle. Lately, after they'd made love, if she couldn't sleep, she'd got into the habit of going down to her studio to work. His palm traversed the warm undulations of the mattress until his fingertips brushed the skin of her hip. Immediately she muttered something unintelligible and rolled her back to him, pulling the duvet tighter around her shoulders. The noise came again. He raised himself on his elbows and strained his ears. It was nothing specific, an occasional faint thump. It could just be the unfamiliar heating system, or a door caught in a draught. At this stage he felt quite calm. The house had formidable security, which was one of the reasons he'd bought it a few weeks earlier. Apart from the floodlights, there was a 3-meter-high perimeter wall with heavy electronic gates, a steel-reinforced front door with a keypad entry system, bulletproof glass in all the ground-floor windows, and a movement-sensitive burglar alarm, which he was sure he turned on before he came up to bed. The chances that an intruder had got past all that and penetrated inside were tiny. Besides, he was physically fit. He'd long ago established that high levels of endorphins enabled him to think better. He worked out. He jogged. An atavistic instinct to protect his territory stirred within him. He slid out of bed without waking Gabrielle and put on his glasses, robe, and slippers. He hesitated and peered around in the darkness, but he could not recall anything in the room that might be useful as a weapon. He slipped his mobile into his pocket and opened the bedroom door. A crack at first, and then fully. The light from the lamp downstairs shed a dim glow along the landing. He paused on the threshold, listening. But the sounds, if there had ever been sounds, which he was beginning to doubt, had ceased. After a minute or so he moved towards the staircase and began to descend very slowly. Perhaps it was the effect of reading Darwin just before he fell asleep, but as he went down the stairs he found himself registering, with scientific detachment, his own physical symptoms. His breath was becoming short, his heartbeat accelerating so rapidly it was uncomfortable. His hair felt as stiff as fur. He reached the ground floor. The house was a Belle Epoque mansion built in 1902 for a French businessman who'd made a fortune out of extracting oil from coal waste. The whole place had been excessively interior designed by the previous owner, left ready to move into, and perhaps for that reason Hoffmann had never felt entirely at home in it. To his left was the front door, and immediately ahead of him the door to the drawing room. To his right, a passage led towards the house's interior. Dining room, kitchen, library, and a Victorian conservatory that Gabrielle used as her studio. He stood absolutely still, his hands raised ready to defend himself. He could hear nothing. In the corner of the hall, the tiny red eye of the movement sensor winked at him. If he was not careful, he would trigger the alarm himself. This had already happened twice elsewhere in Coligny since they moved in. Big houses wailing nervously for no reason, like hysterical rich old ladies behind their high ivy-covered walls. He relaxed his hands and crossed the hall to where an antique barometer was mounted on the wall. He pressed a catch, and the barometer swung outwards. The alarm control box was hidden in a compartment behind it. He reached out his right forefinger to enter the code to switch the system off, and then checked himself. The alarm had already been deactivated. His finger stayed poised in mid-air while the rational part of his mind sought for reassuring explanations. Perhaps Gabrielle had come down after all, had switched the system off and had forgotten to turn it back on again when she returned to bed. Or he'd forgotten to set it in the first place. Or it had malfunctioned. Very slowly he turned to his left to inspect the front door. The gleam of the lamplight reflected in its glossy black paint. It appeared to be firmly closed, with no sign it had been forced. Like the alarm, it was of the latest design and also controlled by the same 4-digit code. He glanced back over his shoulder, checking the stairs and the corridor leading to the interior of the house. All was still. He moved towards the door. He tapped in the code. He heard the bolts click back. He grasped the heavy brass handle and turned it, then stepped out onto the darkened porch.